a new video game machine launches, it can be an exciting time. It usually means the new technology will give us brand new possibilities with graphics, sound, and gameplay. This was particularly true a few decades ago when technology was advancing at an incredible pace. The jump generation to generation came with massive improvements in color, detail, special effects, and sound quality. Every so often we would get a game so good it made the purchase of a new console worth it all by itself. These games were affectionately referred to as killer apps, and that's what this episode is all about. We will go over 10 games that I consider to be the best launch titles of all time. These games offered so much that I actually wanted the systems they were on just for them. Everything else was a bonus. We are primarily talking about US releases here, as launch games tended to vary quite a bit region to region. Presented in no particular order, my choices for the best launch games ever. There is some discussion about whether Super Mario Bros. Here was actually around for the launch of the North American NES, or if it popped up a few months later. For the sake of this list, let's agree that it was a launch game so I can heap a ton of praise onto it, and it deserves it too. In late 1985, it was still quite normal for many games to be on a single screen, even among the games available for the NES. The side-scrolling stages here were loaded with things to do and find. Mario broke bricks with his head, picked up coins for score, and could get power-ups like mushrooms and fire flowers to help him stay alive longer and increase his offensive capabilities. The momentum-based gameplay felt great, and there were all kinds of enemies to make things difficult. Hidden secrets like extra lives and warp zones kept things interesting, and sometimes you even had to deal with water levels and mazes. It really was a complete package of game design that was a big step up from the stuff home games were typically made of. It wasn't a hard game, and once you knew where the warp zones were, you could beat it in 10 minutes, but this was still a huge part of the appeal of the NES in those early days. Nintendo made it a pack-in eventually, so everyone and their grandma ended up playing this game at some point. It was a huge step up from the original Mario Bros. Title, and just the beginning of many great releases within the series. We can argue all day about whether or not it was a launch game, but I think we all can agree it was a heck of a game either way. When the TurboGrafx-16 launched in 1989, it didn't have staples like Splatterhouse or Bonk's Adventure yet, but it did have the legendary Axe, a side-scrolling action-adventure that was the best-looking game I had ever seen at home at that time. I was mesmerized by its bright colors, epic music, and hard-as-nails gameplay. It had a great power-up system in place where the impact of your attacks were based on a bar at the top of the screen. Attack in rapid-fire succession and you lose power. Measure your attacks and they were far more effective. Most of the gameplay itself is based on heavy platforming and the dispatching of enemies that are well placed in the stages to make your life miserable. The Turbo had launched right beside the Genesis in the United States, and Sega had nothing that looked and sounded this good. It would be another few months before games like Ghouls and Ghosts came along to challenge it, which always made me wonder just how NEC let Sega get a huge head start on them in the first place. When I finally got to own a Turbo, it was one of the first games I got for it, and I didn't regret it a single bit. It was the game I broke out every time one of my friends pulled the 8-bit card out of their behinds, and it still remains one of my favorites today. The Turbo may have had a rough go of it in the US market, but it certainly wasn't due to lack of interesting games. The difficulty will scare away many of you, but for those of you with the dedication to see the credits roll, this one brings a hell of a sense of accomplishment. When I first saw Super Mario World for the Super Nintendo, I kinda chuckled to myself. It was nowhere near as nice looking as Sega Sonic, and I wondered just what Nintendo was thinking releasing such a tame looking game at the launch of its new system. It was definitely a case of judging a game far too soon, however. Mario World was a huge game with a ton of levels, great special effects, hidden secrets, and gameplay that just kept on giving. It wasn't as fast or flashy as Sonic was, but it made up for it with level design and an overall concept that was incredibly well done and fun to play. Its audio presentation was phenomenal too, bringing both new and familiar tunes that sounded great. It was one that kept on giving too. Just because you beat it doesn't mean you found everything. There were stages and new worlds hidden away, so you really had to work to find it all, adding some crazy replay value and bang for your buck. Best part was, Nintendo packed it in with the system at launch, so it was a freaking freebie, and I still consider it one of the best pack-in games of all time. Still relevant today and as fun as ever, Super Mario World is a must-play for everyone. When the Saturn launched in North America early, there wasn't a lot to be happy about. It didn't sell well, and it ended up being a pretty bad decision. But among that debacle, US gamers still got PANZER DRAGOON, an on-rail shooter with 3D viewpoints and action that took place in 360 degrees around you. Built on a futuristic story about a lone dragon battling an evil empire, your job is to blast your enemies into submission wherever you find them. The cool thing is you'll find them all around you. Thanks to its polygon-based engine, it requires you to pay attention to the entire play area. Enemies attack head-on, from behind and from both sides, leaving you little room to rest and recover. On-rail shooters were nothing new then, but the added dimension of having to defend yourself from every angle really added to the appeal. PANZER DRAGOON was also a great-looking game for its time. The sparsely populated world was a byproduct of the wars that had ravaged mankind generations earlier, yet everything still had a natural beauty, like huge open oceans, cave systems, forests, and the ruins contained within. The enemies and world design had numerous inspirations, including French artist Moebius and movies such as Dune. It was one of the better games available for the Saturn in the US for quite some time, and one of the few that drew praise for its graphical prowess. It also happens to have one of the best soundtracks on the Saturn and is required listening for anyone who appreciates video game music. Sequels would come along and add much more to the story, world, and gameplay, but this right here is where it all started. Nintendo faced the harsh reality of the move to 3D gaming brilliantly with Super Mario 64. They essentially made their mascot a gymnastics expert, capable of long jumping, flipping, and all sorts of crazy acrobatics to get across his new 3D landscape. Paired with full analog control, these moves felt effortless and an extension of your will. Nintendo didn't plan on you just jumping around empty levels, and instead gave you icy slopes, volcanoes, and many other harsh environments to play around in. The graphics engine was tailored to the Nintendo 64 hardware and came off both visually pleasing and running at a solid frame rate. Nintendo had done what Sega could not, move their #1 franchise into a 3D world and make gamers salivate at the possibilities. This game was so good, I could sit for hours just running around and playing with the enemies and set pieces. There was a magic to Nintendo's game development, and this product was proof they knew how to make their software appeal to the masses. There was simply nothing like it at the time, and it's a big reason why the Nintendo 64 would sell as well as it did in the West. Should you not have played this gem, I really recommend that you do. The overall concept of collecting stars is simple and easy to understand, yet will consume hours of your life as you hunt for more. A diverse set of worlds and enemies await in this true killer app, if there ever was such a thing. My initial interest in the Game Boy Advance was somewhat weak. I didn't like that Nintendo was going without a backlight and the launch games were looking like stuff I could easily skip. That was until I saw Castlevania Circle of the Moon. It had been a few years since Symphony of the Night had been released, and the idea of having a similar adventure on the go was really appealing. And similar it was. The explorable map was loaded with secrets, it had RPG elements like level progression and items, and it had a card system that allowed you to mix different magical powers for lots of different effects. While it wasn't quite the looker of the previous Metroidvania, it was still a showpiece for Nintendo's new handheld, and you couldn't play it anywhere else. It also had a very good soundtrack, something later GBA-vanias would struggle a bit with. The story was fun and easy to follow as well, though unfortunately it has been stricken from Castlevania canon in the years since. I break this one out every few years to play through it, and it's fun and challenging every single time. Nowadays you have options like backlit GBA systems and emulation, and it looks better than ever. Don't sleep on this one. It's got the staying power of the better console games in the series and was one heck of a launch title back in 2001. The US release of the Dreamcast had no shortage of great games. Between Power Stone, NFL 2K, House of the Dead 2, and Blue Stinger, a list like this could be loaded with just games from that system. But among those was a standout, a game of such rare quality that it easily earns its spot here, and that was Namco's Soul Calibur. This weapons-based fighter was actually a sequel to Soul Blade, or what was also known as Soul Edge. The best part was that the original arcade had been based on PlayStation technology, so a move to the Dreamcast came with radically superior graphics. Namco also saw fit to lavish us with extra modes and options that went well beyond the arcade original, and man was it special. The buttery smooth gameplay put other fighters to shame, and each character had a unique weapon to learn and master. The music was pure epic goodness as well, sounding like something from a high-budget Hollywood film instead of a video game. By the time you saw all the endings, unlocked all the fighters, and opened all the new modes, you had dumped hours into it, easily making it worth every penny of its asking price. The Dreamcast would go on to have a really solid fighting game library full of variety and great arcade ports, but this one right here was always the best. Not to be outdone by the Dreamcast, the PS2 got its own port of a popular Namco fighter that was even better than its original arcade version. Tekken Tag Tournament was team-based combat using the great fighters from the Tekken universe. Like Soul Calibur, the arcade had been based on enhanced PlayStation technology, so the move to PS2 came with big increases in graphical fidelity. In fact, it was easily one of the best looking games on that platform at launch in my opinion. It also had dozens of fighters to choose from, plenty to unlock, and was based on much of the gameplay we had seen in Tekken 3. Like the Dreamcast, the PlayStation 2 also had a solid lineup of launch games, including DOA 2, Armored Core 2, Midnight Club, SSX, and Time Splitters, but Tekken Tag always stood out for me. It was a brave new world where console games were better looking than the arcade version on which they were based, and Namco was making it a habit of releasing some truly awesome titles at the launch of new hardware. This had the gameplay, the content, and the visual pizzazz to make any new owner of the PlayStation 2 a happy camper. Heck, I still think it's a great game today. When Microsoft announced that the much-anticipated Halo Combat Evolved would be an exclusive for their new console, you can bet I was interested in picking it up, and it did not disappoint. I had no clue that what I was about to play would redefine the first-person shooter for me. Everything here was a joy to behold. It looked and sounded incredible, the gameplay was loaded with cool weapons and vehicles, and the stages were absolutely massive in scale. The story was really cool as well. Halfway through, the narrative changes entirely, a new enemy is introduced, and all hell breaks loose. There was an incredible sense of loneliness and isolation as you trekked across Halo's alien world. Every so often you'd come across human survivors, but they usually didn't last very long. Your enemies came in multiple varieties. The grunts were easy to put down, but the stronger guys really felt menacing, and seeing one rush at you with a plasma sword could instill an incredible amount of fear into you. Before long, you even had more bad guys to deal with, a swarming, relentless foe that just never seemed to stop. Multiplayer was fantastic as well, but it was mainly reserved for local play, as Xbox Live had not yet become the juggernaut that every game supported. The maps were laid out quite well, and the combat was satisfying. In a way, it had become the new GoldenEye, a first-person shooter that was better than it had any right to be, and you could play it with your buds. When I beat this one for the very first time, I eagerly restarted a new game so I could do it all over again. And that right there is the mark of an excellent game.
Lifeboat detected. No sign of survivors.
Man, what a mess. Weapons model gets broken open. Weapons and supplies all over the place. Where's the body? How'd that feel?
Our last entry is perhaps the biggest surprise for me personally. I had not enjoyed Twilight Princess or Skyward Sword, so the Zelda franchise was on a hard downturn for me. I had sort of lost touch with it and had no real interest in Breath of the Wild when it was first announced. I was utterly shocked when I played it though. I had never played a Zelda so open and so free where you could go anywhere you wanted and do whatever caught your attention. The land seemed to go on forever, and there was nothing you couldn't cross, climb, or explore. After a brief introduction section, I was off trying to find new weapons, food, clothes, armor, and power-ups. And just that quick, I was hooked. Every new hill hid a valley to hunt and take down bad guys. Every mountain promised new rewards at their summit. And then there was the shrines. These puzzle-like structures were hidden all over the place and granted you spirit orbs that could be used for more life or stamina. It was a glorious return to the open freedom of the very first NES game, but so much more. The combat felt natural too, and after learning the techniques at your disposal, you could really wipe out huge groups of enemies. I'm not one to label games perfect, few even deserve to be in such a conversation, but this is about as perfect as a video game gets in my eyes. Once it gets its hooks into you, you simply cannot put the controller down. This could have had no story whatsoever and you'd still play it. This was also on the Wii U at the time, but the fact that you could play it on the go day one thanks to the Switch was nothing short of a miracle. Nintendo's resilience in the business has been extraordinary, and games like this are a big reason why. So there we are, my picks for the 10 best launch games ever, or at the very least so far. One thing you may have noticed is that I don't have many Sega games on this list, and I think that's an important discussion point itself. While they have had some solid titles at the start of their consoles, there is no doubt there is a glaring lack of true classics. One could argue that until the Dreamcast launched, they had next to nothing that even compares to this list here. The North American Master System, Genesis, and Saturn all had somewhat weak launches, something that you really can't say about any of Nintendo's machines during the same time period. I think this is one of the big differences between the two companies. Nintendo recognized the need for a system seller and had a hell of an eye on what would appeal to the largest fan base. It's also interesting to see how a game of superb quality can literally save a platform. You take away Halo from the original Xbox and you really have to wonder where Microsoft would be as a result. The power an unforgettable game can wield is a truly special thing, and every game here had a profound effect on me and my opinion of the platform they appeared on. They motivated me to continue to support each one, hoping another game of similar quality would make its way out. I'd love to know what you all consider to be the best launch games you've played, so feel free to let me know down in the comments. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.